Hello, you guys. So one of the most common questions that I get asked is, how long did it take for you to sew that dress? How long does it take to sew that top or those pants? And I think the underlying question is, how long will it take you to sew the project? You want to know, how long is it going to take me to sew, Anita? Is sewing time consuming? And the answer is yes. Sewing can be very time consuming. However, there are things that you can do to streamline the process. And in today's video, I have 3 steps that I'm going to share with you that will help to cut down on the amount of time that it will take for you to sew a project, especially if you are a new beginner. When you're coming into sewing, when you're learning, you don't really know all of the different elements and steps that it takes to sew a project until you're in it, until you get into it. So I'm going to share those steps with you. And at the end of this video, I have a very helpful resource to give you. It's a free resource. So make sure that you watch the entire video, get the 3 steps, and then grab that resource so that you can use it to help and cut down on the amount of time that it will take to finish your projects. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so the way we're going to remember the 3 steps is we're calling it an SOS. And I'm calling it SOS because it's here to help you save time with your sewing projects. So the SOS is strategy, organization, and systems. So we're going to start with strategy, and there are 4 questions that you need to ask yourself when you're strategizing before you start your project. And the first question is, why are you sewing this project? And the reason I asked why is because sometimes we get into sewing projects because we see other people making the project. We may see a lot of people in the community sewing one dress that is very popular. And so we want to jump in and sew that same dress too because it looks so amazing on all of these other women. But we need to consider if that fits into our personal style. If it's not something that you would typically wear, but you want to sew it because everybody else is sewing it and it looks really good, think twice about that, because if you do sew that dress or whatever type of garment it is and it doesn't turn out right or you don't like it, you've wasted a lot of time sewing something that you're never going to wear. So that's number 1. Number 2, you want to ask yourself, when do you have time to sew, or when will you make time to sew? And the reason this is important because if you pick a time to sew where you know there are going to be a lot of distractions, then that's going to add to the amount of time that it will take you to finish the project. So for example, if you are a mom with young children, if you choose to sew when your kids are awake, when they're active throughout the day, they're going to be interrupting you while you're sewing, and you're going to have to stop to take time with them to take care of their needs and then go back and forth between your project and taking care of your kids. So if you have young children, then maybe you want to consider sewing at night when they're asleep, or when they're at school, if you have school-age children, or early in the morning before they wake up. So take into consideration when you have time to sew or when you will make time to sew. The third question you need to ask yourself is, will you be using a commercial pattern or if you will be drafting your own pattern? And the reason you need to consider this is because the answer will determine the supplies that you're going to need in the second step. So ask yourself if you will be drafting your own pattern or using a commercial pattern. And then finally, you want to ask yourself, which machines are you going to use for your project? Are you going to be using one machine, your regular sewing machine? Are you going to be using just your serger to sew the project? Will you be using your regular machine to sew the seams and then your serger to finish off the seam allowances? Or will you be using 3 machines like I usually do? Your regular machine to sew the seam or your serger to finish off the seam allowances, and then your cover stitch machine to hem the garment. So depending on the machines that you're going to be using, again, that's going to help determine the supplies that you're going to need in step 2. So the first step is strategy. The second step is organization. And this is huge because If we get into sewing our project and we don't have everything that we need already in place, already where it needs to be, then we're going to spend more time sewing that project, because as we are sewing, we will have to stop to get up and go get this. We'll have to stop to go and find the other item. Whatever it is that you don't have in place before you start sewing, it's going to take you time to get up and down from your machine to go and gather the items. So what I like to do is set up my stations before I start sewing. I set up my cutting station, my sewing station, and my pressing station. Now, if you don't have a large sewing room or a dedicated space where you sew, it's okay. You can still set up stations. And the way you can do that is by creating little baskets. Get yourself a little basket for your cutting tools, a little basket for the things you're going to use at the sewing machine, and then a little basket for the items that you're going to use at your pressing station. Put all of the items that you need for the project that you're working on, and keep those baskets near you when you're sewing. So we have the first step, which is strategy. The second step is organization. And then the third step is systems. So you want to ask yourself, what is my process when I'm sewing a project? And this is the process that you will use for every single garment that you sew. So I'm going to share my process with you, my system, and then you can create your own, something that works for you. So the first thing I do before I sew any project is I pair my fabric and my pattern together. And I'm choosing a pattern that fits my personal style. I'm also choosing fabric that fits my personal style. I'm not going to choose a color just because all the other people in the community are wearing that color, or just because it's in. The fashion industry says this is the color that's in. I don't follow that. I do my own thing. I wear something that complements my body, and fortunately for me, I'm able to wear a lot of colors and a lot of prints. But there are some prints that I just don't like, so I do not use fabric that doesn't look good on my body or that I don't like. So save yourself time by choosing fabric and patterns that fit your personal style. Don't sew something that you're not going to wear. That's a waste of time. And then the next thing that I do in my process is I read the sewing instructions from beginning to end. And I'm reading because I want to see what's involved. I want to see if there are any new techniques that I am not familiar with. And if I do, I will go and research the technique. If I have to, I will pull out my sewing books, my resources. I will go on YouTube to see if there are any videos, and I will study how to create or how to do that technique before getting into my sewing process. The worst thing that you can do is start a sewing project not going through the pattern instructions and get to a step that you have never done before, and then you have to go and learn how to do that. That will prolong the time that it will take for you to sew your project. So make sure that you read your pattern instructions from beginning to end. Then the next thing that I will do is alter the pattern pieces if necessary. Now, I don't want to go in and sew a project, complete it, try it on, and find that it doesn't fit my body. That is a waste of time. So save yourself time by checking the finished garment measurements on the pattern pieces. You will find them on the front pattern piece for the bust, waist, and hip. If your pattern pieces don't have the finished measurements, then you can go in and actually measure the pattern pieces yourself. And maybe I'll create a separate video on how to do that. So make sure you alter your pattern pieces so that they fit your body before you get into sewing your project. And then the next thing I will do is create a muslin, and that's a practice garment for those of you who don't know. And the reason I sew a practice garment is because I want to make sure that the garment fits before I sew the entire thing together. So when you're sewing a muslin, a practice garment, you're only sewing the main seams together. You're not adding all of the detail and the finishes. You're just sewing the main seams. You're trying on the garment to make sure that it fits your body. And when you are sewing a practice garment, you want to sew it with a cheap fabric. You don't want to go and spend a lot of money on fabric to sew a muslin. What I will use if I'm sewing a woven or a garment that uses woven fabric is I will use old bed sheets. I have a cabinet or a pantry, not a pantry, but a linen closet full of old sheets that I have collected to use as practice fabric, muslin fabric. Or if I'm sewing a knit garment, then I will use some old cheap knit that I know I'm not gonna use for a fashion garment that I'm gonna wear out in public. So make sure that you sew up a practice garment so that you know that it fits your body before you cut and sew with your fashion fabric. And then the last thing I will do is I will determine what my sewing sequence will be for each individual project. And the reason I do this is because I don't always follow the pattern instructions from A to Z. So here's what I do in my sewing sequence. The first part of my sequence is prep work. So for the prep work stage, I am interfacing all of the pattern pieces that need to be stabilized. I'm also finishing off the raw edges of facings with my serger, or I'm pressing over a fold for my facings. And the next step of my sewing sequence is I'm sewing as many pieces together, as many straight seams as I can, and then taking them to the serger at the same time. So I'm not sewing a seam, taking it to the serger to finish off my seam allowance, and then taking it to my pressing station to press it, and then going back to sew another piece together and going through the same cycle. I'm sewing as many pieces together as I can at the sewing machine, then I'm taking them to my serger, all of the pieces that I've sewn together to finish off the seam allowance, and then I'm taking all of those pieces to the pressing station to press them. And so once I have all of those main pieces with the straight stitches or zigzag, whichever type of stitch you're using, when I have all of those pieces sewn, serged, and pressed, then I can go back to my sewing machine and start sewing pieces together with an intersecting seam. So I'm getting as much done at one station as I can before I go to the next station. Now, when you're following along with your pattern instructions, they don't instruct you to do that. So that's kind of going outside of the box and, doing your own thing, but it saves time. So that's it. That's your SOS. Those are the 3 steps that you can use to save time when you're sewing your projects. And now for the free resource. I have created a sewing project checklist. It's a PDF download, and it will help you to gather all of the items that you need for all of your stations before you start your project. I've also included what you need to do to your sewing machine before you start your project. And all you have to do to get the PDF is to click on the link in the description box below this video and grab your resource. And then you will have your SOS, and you can get started on your next project with confidence, knowing that you're not going to be wasting a lot of time. Thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, please hit the like button down below, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.